against human sacrifice. Oh, why did it just start now? Abraham's entire career, he's preaching against human sacrifice. And all of a sudden, he's prepared to do something against everything he preached. So that's one difficulty. Another difficulty, and this relates to his son, it's the only son, it's his only descendant. It's not a question of son, daughter. It's his only descendant, and this is his legacy. For Abraham has a mission to spread the knowledge of God into the world, and he has been successful doing that. It took a few thousand years, but by now, billions of people consider themselves the spiritual children of Abraham. He needs a child to continue to perpetuate. It wasn't like you can buy a website and write a book and later people will buy the book. It doesn't work that way. You have to have a physical person to be able to carry your legacy and spread the ideas. So basically, he's putting an end to everything he taught because he's contradicting everything he taught, and also he's also undermining the spreading of these teachings to the future. And that's why it's so difficult. It's difficult on a natural level, it's difficult on a philosophical level, and it's difficult on a practical level if this is what he's trying to do, is to spread the oneness of Hashem. So it goes against everything it goes against every fiber of his being. And that's why it's a difficult test. So that's the end. That's the story. So I want to say something. If anybody wants to comment about any of the other stories about this story, please don't hesitate. Otherwise, I'm going to give a little bit of a big picture, and this is something that I said in the past. So if you heard it in the past, I apologize in advance, but it's just sort of the framing of what is happening in this parsha. So I just want to say that there's a very interesting. I'm going to say there's an interesting question of where the portions divide. In other words, why is the stories of Abraham divide exactly where they divide? And it's a very strange thing because the opening statement of this week's parsha, God appears to Abraham, doesn't even say to Abraham, it says to him, which means it's a direct continuation to what happened in the previous sentence in last parsha. Last parsha, it was about the circumcision. Abraham circumcised himself. And this parsha is the immediate aftermath. And in the immediate aftermath is that God appears to him. Why to him? Who's him? God appeared to, okay, I don't like this translation. Vayera elav Hashem. God appeared to him. Who's him? Well, last parsha, it's Abraham. And that's why Rashi says that it's a continuation to last parsha. Vayera elav, God appeared to him in order to visit the sick. Abchama Bar Chanina said it was the third day after circumcision, when it is the most painful, and the Holy One, blessed be He, came and asked after his well-being. In other words, this week's parsha is Abraham is sick because it's after a circumcision, so God comes to visit him. And when it says God appeared to him, you know who it's talking about because it's a continuation to the previous portion, which was the circumcision. And you also know why God appears to him, because he has to visit the sick. It's a great mitzvah to visit the sick. By the way, just an interesting point here. How does the Medrash know? How does Rashi know? The commentaries know? The Medrash know where Rashi takes it from? That God comes to visit the sick. Where does he get that from? It doesn't say so explicitly. So remember, the commentaries and the Medrash fill in the missing parts, but it has to be based on something in the text. So what is it based on? So one interpretation is it's based on the fact that anytime there's revelation of God to people, there's always a message. It says God appears to Abraham and says so and so. God speaks to Moshe. Even in the last parsha, it says God appears to Abraham and says so and so. This is the only place in the entire Torah where it says God appears to him, but it doesn't say anything. So it's the only place that God shows up for a visit and doesn't say anything. So that's why the rabbis say he came. It could not have been to communicate anything. It has to be a different reason. What's the reason? Oh, it's a continuation of the circumcision. Point I'm trying to make is this. Point I'm trying to make is that the place where the portion divides is very unnatural because it's a continuation to the circumcision. It should have been part of the story of the circumcision story. Instead, it's cut in between. Pun intended. It's cut in between. Where you have up to the circumcision is one parsha, and the aftermath of the circumcision is the next parsha. What happens at that exact point? So that's the second point I want to make. But the first point I want to make is that a lot of what happens in this parsha is that Abraham has to develop. Abraham is a great guy. He has to develop. And one way to think about it is we know that we have three patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And in the Kabbalah, it's explained that why do we have three patriarchs and not four? Maybe, and why do we have specifically these three? Maybe Abraham is the patriarch and the rest are the descendants. We classify each of them as each of these three as patriarchs because they are not only biological patriarchs of the Jewish people, but they're the spiritual patriarchs of the Jewish people. Meaning to say that each of those people, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, represent a certain quality, and they pass on that quality to their descendants. So in other words, every Jew has these qualities of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and that's why we could say they are my patriarchs because I inherit their gene pool and I inherit these three qualities. And if you look through the stories of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, which is basically from this point till the end, well, a nice chunk of the book of Genesis, the Kabbalists point out, and it's relatively clear in the verse, and that there's basically three primary emotions, and each one of these patriarchs represent one of these primary emotions. And Abraham represents the primary emotion of love. Abraham is a man of love. Abraham is always sharing. Abraham is always spreading knowledge. And even here, the opening scene is he's sitting waiting for guests. He wants to give kindness. He wants to perform kindness. Abraham doesn't see bad in anybody. He doesn't want to send away Hagar. He doesn't want to send away Ishmael. He prays for the wicked people of Sodom. Abraham is the epitome of kindness. And later you'll see Isaac is judgment or discipline. And Jacob is the blend of the two. But that's compassion. We'll leave Jacob for later. Right now we have Abraham and we have Isaac. And Abraham is a man of kindness, of compassion, of giving. Let's say, forget compassion, kindness, of giving, of expression. And Isaac is his son, but he's also the son of his mother. And his mother is a woman of discipline. And discipline is awe. Discipline is judgment. All those categories holding back. That's what the Kabbalah would call the left column. The right column is expression. The left column is respect, is discipline, is holding back, not because you're a bad person, but because in some ways, the best way to give is to hold back, right? You can talk, but listening, in some ways, holding back my own perspective and listening to the other person in some ways is even more important. In many ways, it's even more important. So the point here is you have Abraham and you have Isaac, and they're very, very different. You have Abraham and Sarah, who are very different, and that plays out in the conflicts that they have in this week's parsha. Even though last week's parsha, they get along with almost 100% of the time. This week's parsha, the conflicts become a little stronger because they're so different spiritually. But this parsha is a story of Abraham's development. And development means that in this parsha, Abraham understands the limitations of love. And that is that sometimes you have to have not just love, but discipline and strength and the ability to stand up for what you know is right, even though you have to do things such as discipline and that are painful for yourself and for others. And if you want to look through the story, you will see that throughout this story, throughout this parsha, almost every episode in this parsha, Abraham is struggling between his kindness and the need to show restraint, discipline, respect, call it what you want. I'm just going to say, the culmination is the Akedah, the binding of Isaac. What happens after the binding of Isaac? So when we hear the binding of Isaac, putting aside the emotional difficulty of it, he prepared to kill his son, we can talk about that later if you want to. I'll put that aside for a second. If you say, God tested Abraham, what was the test? So you would say, the test is, does Abraham really love God? Does Abraham's love for God take precedent over his love for his beloved son? That's not what the test is about. How do I know? Because the Torah itself is kind enough to tell me at the end what the test was about. The angel tells Abraham at the end of the test, he says, Ki ata yadaita, I'm going to bless you. He says, because now I know that you fear or you're in awe of God. That's very profound. It's not a question if Abraham loves God. That's not a question. That was never a question. The test is, could you do something that requires awe, or is discipline, or is holding back your natural emotion? That is something that we didn't know Abraham could do until this parsha he develops. And ultimately, the ultimate test is, could you go against your nature in the service of God? And why it's so important to go against your nature in the service of God, in addition to expressing your nature your entire career. But you have to have a moment where you also could transcend your nature. And that's what the Akedah is about. So in other words, if you're looking at the story this way, that this parsha is talking about, could Avraham develop from only love to love that incorporates some discipline as well, or some awe as well, or some holding back as well, then the highlight of that is the binding of Isaac. And we talked about this in the past. I'll say it again. The Kabbalah explains you can't have one wing. You have to have two wings to fly. A relationship has to have both wings. You have to have love. You also have to have awe. And even though Abraham is primarily love, he also needs awe. And Isaac is primarily awe. He also needs love. So there's a lot to talk about, a lot to say, a lot to think about. But that's just sort of trying to put a framework about what this entire parsha is dealing with. Go ahead, Doctor, please. I think you may be on mute because I don't hear you. No, you're not on mute, so why don't I hear you? No, you're not on mute, but I don't hear you. Now you're on mute. Still don't hear? Is it just me? Is anyone else hear the doctor? No, we don't hear you, doctor. I think you may have to do something with your microphone because you're not muted.
Go ahead.
Oh, now we hear you. There you go.
Oh, you can hear me.
Now I hear you.
What I was going to ask you about is the relationship between awe and fear. On one hand, one could say he's holding back. It represents the element of restraint. He's incorporated an aspect that characterized Sarah and her toughness in telling Hagar to go, and basically in choosing Isaac as the
heir.
On the other hand, what I'm struck by is that he never said anything to God, like, could you take something else? Why this particular thing? I mean, there was no conversation. Why? I mean, I know he's a very loving guy, but you said he's also someone who's developing some backbone, some ability to restrain. Is it a sign of restraint? Is it a sign of fear? But why, in this instance, does he not say something to God about, why are you asking me for this?
That's a very good question. I don't know that I have the answer to that question because it's a difficult story to talk about. I can't put myself in his shoes. What I could say is that Abraham pushes back against God when God wants to punish the people of Sodom. And Abraham stands up and he says it's a terrible idea. And he says that it's unjust. And he pushes back and they argue and they negotiate. So it's a logical question is why does Abraham negotiate with God when it comes to the people of Sodom, but not when it comes to his own child? That's a difficult question. I'm not going to say I have a perfect answer for that or a smooth answer for that. What I would say, just to put it out there, is that there's a difference in the stories when Abraham, and by the way, and Moses also, when they argue with God, it's almost like God opens an opening. God says, this is what I'm about to do. He doesn't say, what do you think? But that's essentially what he does. If God comes to Abraham and says, oh, by the way, I want to destroy Sodom. I'm thinking of destroying Sodom. So Abraham's like, so what are you telling me? Go do what you want to do. Well, leave me, like, why are you telling this to me? Obviously, because you want to hear my opinion. So I'm going to hear your opinion. But when you have a direct command, then maybe arguing and pushing back may not be the appropriate response. So that's the only thing I would say. The difference between when there's an opening for a discussion and when it's not a discussion. So that's what there is to say. So you know what? I don't know if we'll have so much time to go beyond go back to the Akedah. So why don't I just circle back to the Akedah? I'm going to say two more points about the binding of Isaac, and then we'll go back to the beginning of the parsha. And in other words, look at different angles. So the two things I want to say about the parsha, about the binding of Isaac, is that let's say a person is like Abraham, is kind, and he's performing kindness and he's serving God with the attribute of love, which is consistent with his nature. So what is the problem? Everything is wonderful. The problem is he really serving God, or am I serving God, or am I doing it because it makes me feel good? In other words, anytime I do something that is consistent with my nature, I'm doing it because I like to do it. Am I really doing it for the other person? So that's about God, but you can think about this in any relationship. Let's say you're going to say you have somebody you really care about and you love to spend time with them. And you know what? And the person tells you, let's go and do this activity that we both love to do, or whatever it is. I like to go skiing. I like to go jogging. I like to go swimming, whatever it is. Let's spend time together. Let's both do something that we both love. Wonderful. So you spend a lot of time together doing the thing that makes you feel good. It makes the other person feel good as well. It makes you feel good as well. Then the question is, then you can take a view in this and say, is this person really here for the other person? Is this about commitment to the other? Or is this about expansion of self? I like to do this activity. You like to do this activity. So it's win-win. We'll do it together. We'll both be happy. In other words, at some point, that question becomes, do I realize that at what point am I serving? I'm serving God, but am I also serving myself? So there's a very interesting verse and Rashi where Rashi, when God introduces the commandment of the binding of Isaac, God says a very interesting expression. God tells Abraham, "Kach na." Na is please. God says, "Please take your son." What's the please? Usually, when you say commandment, especially a harsh commandment, it's not about please. It's about do this. I need you to do this for me. What's the please? So Rashi quotes the Medrash, and the Medrash says as follows. The Medrash says, "Please pass this test." Because according to the tradition, there are 10 tests that Abraham passes. And this is the 10th, and this is the hardest one. And the first 9, Abraham passes. So God tells Abraham, please take your son, meaning please pass this test. Why so? So the Medrash continues that God tells Abraham, because so people should not say the first 9 are meaningless. Ein mamash, there's no substance to the first 9. Now that is a very strange Medrash, because one second, let's say Abraham doesn't pass the 10th test. Okay, so he'll get a 90 on the test. There's been 10 tests. He passed the first 9, which some of them were very difficult. He left his father's home. Sometimes some people say he risked his life to preach the oneness of Hashem, put his life in jeopardy, he spoke against the king, whatever it is. So he's got 9 tests. He passed 9 tests. You give him a 90. He's not going to be able to pass the 10th test. So you get a 90. Why does God say, according to the Medrash, the way the Medrash formulates the conversation here, God says, do me a favor. You got to pass the 10th. You got to get 100. Why? Because if you don't get 100, you get a 0. There'll be no substance in the first 9. Why would there be no substance in the first 9? That's a very strange statement. So that's where the Hasidic commentary says like this. What does it mean there'll be no substance in the first 9? The first 9 the first 9 tests Abraham passes because they are an expression of his love to God. But it's an expression of his love. And he is a man of love. So people are going to say, of course you're serving God with love because you're a man of love. What's going to happen when you have to suppress your own love? That you cannot do. In other words, they're going to say the first 9 are nothing because everything you're doing is consistent with your nature. You're not going beyond your nature. If you're doing something that makes you uncomfortable, that you don't have the ability to do. So in other words, if you pass the 10th test, that shows that the first 9 you did not because they were consistent with your nature, but because you were serving God. So in other words, an example. Let's say I'm spending time with somebody I love, and we all do all kinds of activities. And in my entire relationship over many decades, I never do anything that I don't enjoy. So you can look at that and say, sorry, this guy is serving himself, even though you're doing things that both of you enjoy. But if you can only do things that you enjoy and you're serving yourself, you're not really in a relationship. But what happens if once in a while I could do something that I don't enjoy for the other person? I have commitment for the other person in a way that makes me uncomfortable. If I can do that, then that's not just about that event. That shows that all the other time that I'm doing, all the other activities that I'm doing, and everything else that I'm doing that is in fact consistent with my nature, I'm not doing it for a selfish purpose. I'm doing it to transcend and connect to you. So in other words, if you can't go beyond yourself, that questions everything that you're doing that is consistent with self. So that's the idea here, that the binding of Isaac it shows you that Abraham is in awe of God. He can hold back his love. And that shows that everything he did until now in the love, it was not a question of just serving himself and doing something consistent with his own nature, but it was something of also in the service of God. So that's a little bit about the binding of Isaac. Then there's a very, very cute interpretation that I must share. I probably shared it in the past, but it's too nice not to say. Again, consistent with what we were saying, that Abraham and Isaac are very different in character. And if you look at their life stories, they're very different because their spiritual character is different. One is love, one is awe. So this is the binding of Isaac. Again, I didn't mean to start at the end, but it came up, so we'll talk about this. We'll finish up. This is the last thing, hopefully, that we'll say about the binding of Isaac. So God tells Abraham, take your son that you love, raise him, bring him in as an offering on the land of Moriah. Go to one of the mountains that I will show you, designate to you. Okay. Abraham walks for 3 days. On the third day, Abraham raises his eyes and saw the place from afar. He tells his 2 lads, sit here, me and this, and the lad will go and we'll bow and return. It's an interesting thing. He thought they're going to return. Whatever. We're not going to into that right now. Let's read verse 6 and 7. Abraham took the wood for the ascent offering and placed it on his son Isaac. He took the fire and knife in his hand, and the 2 of them walked on together. Look at verse 7. Verse 7. Isaac said to Abraham his father, my father, and he replied, here I am, my son. Isaac said, the fire and the wood are here, but where is the lamb for the ascent offering? Verse 8. Abraham replied, God will see to a lamb for an ascent offering. Meaning he wasn't clear. He didn't say that you're going to be the lamb, but he said something, he was vague. And it turned out that indeed there was a lamb, there was a ram, but that's another story. But I want to address the first half of verse 7, which I would argue that we actually don't need this entire clause. I'm highlighting it here. Isaac said to Abraham, his father, my father, and he replied, here I am, my son. I would venture to say that you don't need this. The verse could have just read, Isaac said, here is the fire and the wood are here, but where is the lamb for the ascent offering? So the Kabbalists have a beautiful interpretation. They say like this. This is the only conversation in the Bible between Abraham and Isaac. The only time they talk. I mean, they're always in the same scene together, but they never talk. This is the only conversation. And the conversation and the introduction is, Isaac said to Abraham, his father, my father, and he's replied, here I am, my son. One way to read this is, Isaac never felt that he's the son of his father, and the father never felt that he's the father of his son, because they were so different. Only as they're walking to the binding of Isaac, and it occurs to Isaac that my father may be offering me as a sacrifice, meaning my father could not just express love, but also express discipline. Now he recognizes, oh, my father has discipline. I feel discipline. I feel I'm not in the business of self-expression and love. I'm in the business of devotion and discipline. Now I see my father can do that. Now I see that he's my father. Now I see that we share a characteristic. So Isaac is surprised. Isaac says to Abraham, his father, he says, my father. This is a moment of discovery. He says, now I see that you're my father. What does Abraham reply? And he replied, here I am, my son. Yes, Hineni, I'm here. Hineni b'ni, here I am, my son. Now they connect, because now they recognize each other within each other. And then the story continues, etc. So that's the big idea. The big idea of this parsha is not enough. You have to have not just love, but also awe, and also discipline, and also commitment. And again, Abraham is primarily love, but he needs to have awe as well, and respect as well. And with Isaac, it's the reverse. And only when you have both of those can you get the blending of the two, which would be Jacob, which is not for now, will be for in a few weeks from now. So that is a little bit about the last section of the parsha. I want to go back to the first section of the parsha, which is the scene where Abraham is sitting at the entrance of his tent, and it's the heat of the day, and God appears to Abraham, and Abraham sees 3 angels, and he runs to the angels. So let's go to that scene for a moment. But to do that, let's first talk about what I mentioned earlier. So in other words, where is the change in the parsha? So why did the parsha switch right here? So the first interpretation I said is up to this point is Abraham is a man of love. And then this parsha, he starts developing from a man of love to a man of love who also could incorporate discipline and awe and commitment. But now we want to say, but why exactly was the parshas cut at exactly this point? So here you go to the traditional commentators, and they say, look, very interesting thing. What happens? What happens is the reason why the parsha splits exactly where it is because Abraham before the circumcision and Abraham after the circumcision are two completely different people. And we'll try to show what the dramatic change is. The dramatic change in Abraham before the circumcision and Abraham after the circumcision. And therefore, the parsha, naturally, you're going to get a new parsha because it's a new person. It's a new stage in life. It's a new stage in the spiritual development of Abraham. Exactly at the point of circumcision. And it has to be alluded to in the verse because everything has to be alluded to in the verse. So the big idea is as follows. What's the difference? What is circumcision? And we talked about this. We talked about this in the past. I think it was last week, or maybe it was, I don't remember if it was Tuesday or Friday. I don't remember. But the bottom line is, what is circumcision? Circumcision is I think we spoke about it last Tuesday. Circumcision is a sign, not that we're connected to God, because Abraham was connected to God even before the circumcision for many decades, and Abraham understood God. And Abraham was able to connect to God and speak to God and understand philosophically, have a philosophical relationship with God. That's wonderful. But that's not who Abraham is, and that's not what Judaism is. Judaism is about connecting the physical and the spiritual. In other words, making that the point of Judaism is to make the physical object holy. And that's why every mitzvah in Judaism, almost every mitzvah, actually every mitzvah, is related to something physical. Even the few mitzvah that are not physical, that let's say love, they say no, love is physical, because if you love somebody and they walk into the room, your heartbeat is gonna change. And when it says love the Lord your God, it means to the extent that your physical heartbeat changes. In other words, every mitzvah has to have a practical physical expression in the physical world. And that's why every mitzvah is done in a very specific way, because it's a physical thing, and physical things have to be done in a very tangible and exact way. Okay, so if the point of Judaism is to sanctify the physical world, what mitzvah demonstrates this principle more than any other mitzvah? We talked about this last week, is circumcision. As God says, my covenant will be in your flesh. You can actually see the difference. The physical flesh has been changed as a result of the circumcision, as a result of the bond with God. Okay, if that's the case, so circumcision represents the idea that holiness could affect the physical world and could connect to the physical world. So now you see something very interesting. Let's open up the scene. And we're going to read the scene, and you heard it before, so it's not surprising, but really this is a radical scene. Even the verse 1. Verse 1 is the most radical scene, and I'll show you why in a minute, but it's a very radical scene, so don't get confused. Don't think this is a normal scene. Verse 1, God appeared to Abraham in Elonim, the plains of Mamre. Abraham was sitting at the entrance of the tent in the heat of the day. This is a radical scene. Why is it so radical? We'll take the doctor's question, and then I'll tell you why it's so radical. And I'm going to try to prove it to you why that it's radical. Go ahead, doctor. No, we still having, oh no, now you're unmuted. You're muted.
Am I unmuted now?
Now we hear you.
Can you hear me? All right, so here's my question. And, the beauty of studying with you is questions arise that never occurred to me before. But here's a question. Very often in our day and age, and apparently in the Orthodox community, it's taboo, people have tattoos. And they have tattoos that suggest a connection between the spiritual and the physical, in the sense that usually the tattoo is about something profoundly meaningful. Now, some people have mom tattooed on. Some people have their girlfriend or their wives. Some have something else they believe in, which presumably is metaphysical. Why was the penis chosen rather than having a tattoo?
That's a good question. Why a tattoo? That's a good question. I'm just going to say, I'll do the easy answer. In other words, the point is this: the reason why tattoos are prohibited is because the understanding is that the body belongs to God. That's the understanding. God gives you possessions. The possessions are yours. Your money is yours. Your possessions are yours. But life belongs to God. And that's why your body belongs to God. And that's why you are allowed to waste your money. It's not recommended, but you are allowed to waste your money. You are allowed to give away your money. It's up to you, because that God hands over to you. But your life is not given to you. The life is on loan from Hashem. And that's why in Judaism and others, in Western culture understands this to some degree, or at least used to, that, if somebody's going to commit suicide, we used to try to stop them. Because we say, why not? If you believe in the person has autonomy, they have autonomy over their body, let them destroy their own life. No. Judaism is clear. God tells Noach, you can't kill yourself. Why not? Because it's not yours to destroy. So the simple answer would be why. So in other words, so one reason of the tattoo, one reason. There's other reasons too, but one reason would be it's not my body is not mine. I can't make changes to it. I can't abuse it. By the way, if you have questions like it comes to questions, modern day questions such as cosmetic surgery, which is that a problem? Is that allowed? And most opinions say it is allowed. So what exactly the difference is? Okay, for that you have to talk about medical ethics, and we have to go beyond the scope. But the bottom line is that essentially we say it's God, it's God, it's not me. It's God, it's not me. It's God, it belongs to God, does not belong to me, and therefore, I can only do it if God allows it. That's one point. But if you want to talk more spiritually, certainly Kabbalistically, the circumcision is related to procreation, because procreation is about expression to the future generations. And if you talk about what circumcision represents, it represents removing the covering. So it represents expression. So in other words, things are covered until there's circumcision. Circumcision is expression. So it's related to procreation mystically. So that's a little bit. There's probably more to say, but I think that suffices for right now. But maybe we'll circle back to it if it comes up, because it may come up. So again, Abraham is sitting. This opening scene of the parsha is Abraham is sitting at the entrance of his tent on his chair in the heat of the day. Now you look at verse 1, it seems like, and God appears to him. You look at verse 1, it seems like it's only a setup. It's a setup to verse 2. The main thing, the drama starts verse 2. Abraham sees 3 people. And now this is a drama. Why is it a drama? Because we'll see in a minute, Abraham runs to those 3 people to invite him. The question is, why is he running to those 3 people? God is talking to him. God appeared. So imagine you have God is sitting at your dining room table or at your front door, and now 3 people show up. Now you have a conflict. Am I going to go to God, stay here with God, or am I going to go and run and greet the 3 people? So we can talk about that in a moment. Hopefully we'll have time. But the point here is the drama starts in verse 2. But the commentaries point out, no. Don't make no mistake. The drama actually starts at verse 1. Why? He's sitting at the table, sitting on a chair at the opening in midday, and God appears. And what happens? And nothing happens. That's big news. Why? If you look at last parsha, I'm just going to read an example, just an example or two. If you want to look, for example, chapter 15. Okay, so let's look at, give me just a second, I'll show it to you. Genesis chapter 15. Okay, this is just an example. There's other examples. Last week's parsha, after these incidents, the word of the Lord came to Abraham in a vision. What does a vision mean? It's a vision. It's an imagination. He's not sitting in the middle of the day and living his life. And it's actually more clear in a minute. Let's look a little. Next time God appears to Abraham, verse 12. Now the sun was ready to set, and a deep sleep fell upon Abraham. And behold, a great darkness was falling upon him. Abraham collapses. God appears to Abraham when he is asleep. And there are other cases in last week's parasha that say that when God appears to Abraham, basically Abraham is never awake in an upright position, sitting and able to communicate with other people while he's experiencing the revelation of God. Up to this point, when when Abraham would prophesy, he would fall down on the ground. He would go into a trance. It would be in a vision. It would be in his sleep. So what the commentaries are pointing out is that the big news is that Abraham could sit in middle of the day, not at night, experience the presence of God while he is interacting with other people while he sees angels and while he sees people, and he goes to those people, and he's inviting them into his house, and simultaneously he can experience revelation of God. What happened? What happened is the flesh changed, the physical body changed. It used to be that physical body and physical consciousness was a sort of a contradiction to spiritual enlightenment. And that's why if you wanted to experience spiritual enlightenment, you have to sort of retract from the physical consciousness and from sitting upright. But because of the circumcision, and circumcision again, it means removing the covering, removing the concealment. Now the physical is no longer a contradiction to God. It doesn't conceal over the presence of God. Now the physical has been refined to the point where you can actually experience the presence of God on a regular day, in your middle of your regular business. And this leads us to the next discussion, which is the big discussion about Abraham leaving the presence of God and speaking to the angels and going to the angels. So for example, let's go back for a second. Abraham sees the three angels. That's in verse 2. Verse 3, he said, my masters, if I have found favor in your eyes, please do not pass me, your servant, by. In other words, there's three people. And he tells the guy, Vayomer, he says, Adonai, my master, or my masters, my Lord, or my lords, please don't pass. Please don't go away. And he says, please let water be brought, wash your feet, and recline under the tree. I will bring a piece of bread so that you can gather strength, and only then will you continue on your way. After all, you have paid me, your servant, a visit. So you already came by, you may as well come inside. So that's a beautiful scene, and Abraham goes and he gets them food and drink, etc. What's the interesting verse is verse 3. He said to all three, my masters, if you found favor in your eyes, please do not pass me, your servant, by. Rashi quotes there's two ways to read this verse. Adonai, my master, could be my Lord. It could be he's talking to the people. But this more interesting interpretation is that entire verse 3, Abraham is not talking to the people, the guests. There are angels, but he doesn't know they're angels. He thinks they're people. Abraham is not talking to the people. Abraham is talking to God. Abraham tells God, God, if I find favor in my eyes, don't pass, don't leave me, even though I'm now going to go, and I'm going to go invite my guests. So this is very powerful. Abraham has this conflict. He's a spiritual seeker. He's got a revelation of God. It doesn't happen every day. It happens only rare occasions. He has this profound revelation when he's sitting at the opening of his tent. And then Abraham makes a choice. Am I going to stay with my meditation about God, or am I going to go and am I going to greet the angels, the people? He doesn't know they're angels. And what does he do? He says, God, wait a second. Please don't pass. Don't leave. And instead he says, I'm going to go invite the guests, which is very surprising. And in fact, the sages in the Talmud, when they read the story, they come up with a very nice way of putting it. And they make this statement and they say, inviting guests is greater than greeting the Shekhinah, greeting the divine presence. How do you know? Look at Abraham. Abraham had a choice. Am I going to stay with my meditation, focusing about Hashem, or am I going to invite the guests? So it is greater to inviting guests is greater than greeting the Shekhinah, greeting the divine presence. So that's a beautiful story, beautiful scene, a beautiful idea of how you have to be hospitable and how in some ways it's more important to do a mitzvah to somebody else than to do a mitzvah that you feel connects you to God and you feel like gives you enlightenment. Okay, let's go a little bit deeper. A little bit deeper is, if you just finished telling me that the whole purpose of the circumcision is, and the shift that happens in Abraham, that it used to be that before the circumcision, for Abraham to experience enlightenment or connection to God, he had to go to sleep, he had to fall, he would lose his consciousness. After the circumcision, Abraham could remain in his conscious mind, in the physical consciousness, and still experience the presence of God. If that's what happened, then what's interesting is, now let's reread the story. It's not that Abraham abandons God to go greet the guests. The whole purpose of the story is the opposite. The whole purpose of the story is that when Abraham is speaking to other people, he is in the presence of God. The circumcision tells you that you can be connected to God, not just when you're doing something that's profoundly spiritual, but when you're doing mundane actions, when you're making bread and you're getting meat and you're getting a piece of steak for your guests. And in a way, what it's telling you is the whole point of the story is that you can be with Hashem in your mundane life, and that begins at the circumcision, but it's not limited to the circumcision. And that is what happens with this scene that Abraham tells God, don't leave because I can be with you and be with the guests at the same time. I could be in the physical world and I could be in the spiritual world at the same time. And that's the big, the profound impact of the circumcision, and that's the power of this scene. If you want to go back and read it, when the sages say inviting the guests, greeting guests is greater than great. If you want to do a precise Hebrew, great is inviting guests from greeting the divine presence. So the simple interpretation is inviting guests is greater than greeting the divine presence. But if you read the Hebrew and you read it literally, it could be read greeting guests from the divine presence is great. In other words, when you greet your guests, you are experiencing the divine presence. You're still with God because you're doing the mitzvah. In other words, doing the physical mitzvah is not moving you away from God. To the contrary, that's where you experience the divine presence. So that is a little bit about the big changes in the parsha. Number one, Abraham moves from love to also having discipline. And another way to look at it is Abraham moves from somebody who, to experience spirituality, has to sort of retreat into his consciousness and retreat into a state of vision or of dreaming, to the state where Abraham could be in the middle of the day, in the heat of the day, in the sun, middle of the afternoon, interacting with people and still feel connected to Hashem. So these are the two major shifts. Now there's a lot to talk about. I don't even know where to start from because this was just sort of general introduction. A lot to talk about.
Rabbi, we next meet with you on Friday, is that correct? Or before Friday?
Friday. We meet on Friday.
Okay.
Okay. Let me talk about, there's a lot to say, but I want to talk about Abraham praying for a moment, Abraham praying for the people of Sodom. And this brings into the question of the whole idea of compassion and kindness versus the idea of judgment. And I only have 6 minutes, and this is a big topic, but I'm just going to say 1 or 2 points. And it's related also to the broader discussion that we had before Yom Kippur about the story of Jonah, which turns out is really a debate between what is the right path, God's forgiveness or God's judgment. And Jonah wants judgment, and God wants compassion and forgiveness, and Abraham wants compassion and kindness. And so let's try to address this concept for a minute or two. And in a way, you have to say, what is the business of rachamim, of compassion? Seemingly, compassion is undermining judgment, and if you're undermining justice, it's the opposite of justice, and therefore some people are offended by compassion because they say justice makes sense. Justice means you get what you deserve, and if you're going to say if you're going to award and not punish the wicked people, then what's going to happen? Evil is going to flourish. So, in other words,
what's up?
In other words, how do you think about the concept here of why is Abraham, who wants kindness, who wants goodness, what is it going to help to pray for the wicked people of Sodom? We have that story earlier also because in the story of Noach, of the flood. So after the flood, or once the people were destroyed, it says that Hashem says, "No longer will I bring the flood." Elohim says, "No longer will I bring the flood," and Elohim is the name of judgment. I don't want to get into this, but the bottom line is the judgment was transformed to compassion. What exactly is compassion? What exactly is happening here? So there's a beautiful interpretation that says as follows, and it's all based on the Hebrew language, because the Hebrew has certain nuances and connects certain words are related, and that conveys a certain truth that you would not see in other languages. So the word for rachamim, compassion, is the same word, exact same word. Rachem is have compassion. It's the exact same letters as rechem, which is womb. Exact same words, exact same letters. So these words are very much connected. So what is the connection? So the simple interpretation maybe is that, well, the mother has compassion. Okay, that's fine. But there's deeper connections too. One of the deeper connections is to explain what's the purpose of compassion and when compassion is a good thing and when compassion is misguided. So when you have compassion on somebody and you say, well, you're not deserving, but I'm going to be kind anyway. It is only compassion and only positive compassion if it's related to the womb, meaning if it gives birth, if you think it's going to give birth to something new in the person. In other words, having compassion on a person who sinned is related to the idea of identifying the potential, the positive potential in the person, and helping that potential, birthing it into fruition, or letting it expand, or letting it grow, and ultimately birthing it into the real world. And that's the idea of a womb. That's what the womb is. The womb is to give birth to something that gets the seed of the male, which is in a state of just the point, just a point, and then it's going to be expanded and ultimately created into the real world. So in other words, the guy is undeserving. So why would you have compassion? You have compassion because God identifies within this person, or somebody you can identify within this person, the potential. And you say, if I only give this person another chance and I help the person develop the potential that they have for goodness, then I am the womb which will allow for that person's goodness to grow. And the womb is the only justification for compassion. And that's why when there is no potential for compassion, the greatest compassionate thing to do is to destroy the evil, right? So that's the point. The point here is when there is a point that could be expanded upon, then the compassion, it becomes like the womb. And the commentaries point out, the Kabbalistic commentaries point out that the same thing happens in Abraham's conversation with the people of Sodom, conversation with God regarding the people of Sodom. One of the things that Abraham says he's almost apologizing for speaking to God and arguing with God. He says, I began to speak to God. I am just dust and ashes. Anochi afar va'efer. I'm dust and ashes. What does that mean? So it means he's being humble. Okay, but there's all kinds of commentaries. Some say, I almost became ashes because when the king of Ur-Kasdim tried to kill me and God saved me with his compassion. So one way to think about this is like this. The question, what Abraham is telling the people, I'm Abraham. You know why I'm Abraham? You know why I'm connected to God? Not because I'm so great, because by myself, I'm just dust and ashes. The reason why I'm so great is because God performed kindness to me. And because God performed kindness to me, that's what got me to reciprocate and appreciate God and ultimately serve God. So what Abraham is telling God, if you have compassion on the people of Sodom, then they also may be transformed. In other words, the justification for kindness is not that judgment doesn't matter. It's not that the negative things that they did don't matter. It's that by the compassion, hopefully, if you assess that that's the case, then by the compassion, you can bring the positivity that they have within themselves into fruition. And that's what Abraham tries to do. And that's what ultimately God says they are at a point that it's beyond help, and therefore you have to destroy them. But interestingly, Sodom is saved by Lot. Avram's nephew has two sons. Their two daughters. He has children with his two daughters, and they became Ammon and Moab. But ultimately, a very strange story is that we believe that we know, according to the tradition and according to the Bible, Ruth, who becomes the matriarch of King David, is a convert from Moab. And so in other words, the monarchy in the Jewish people, ultimately the Messiah who's going to come and correct the entire world, who comes from David, comes from Moab, comes from Sodom. So ultimately there is good in Sodom that is saved. And that's another whole story that why is Torah so obsessed about Sodom and how ultimately the redemption does come from Sodom. But that's beyond the scope of right now because we're already 101. But all I'm trying to say is that the idea of compassion and the idea of kindness is not just giving a blank check. It's the compassion and the kindness. What that does is it allows the person to express, it allows you to identify the positivity within that person. And then you have to be like a womb. You have to be able to birth that positivity and make it come from the state of potential to the state of the actual. So ladies and gentlemen, that's the story in short. Of course, a lot more to say, but comments and questions are always welcome. Thank you for joining. Have a wonderful